understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? My God, welcome to the podcast. What a week. What a week. We had the assassination of Donald Trump, the attempted assassination. We have Joe Biden pulling out. We have then Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris getting more money in one day than any other Democrat or Republican ever, and changing profoundly the energy in the American race. You know, somebody said to me, this is a Gen X woman, that's our generation, with Gen Z vibes.
Yeah.
You see that she's really, the young folk are coming out, they're saying, we haven't seen anything like this since Obama. People are animated. They were so fed up with Joe Biden. And now that Joe has thrown in the towel, one interesting thing, John, about America is I was looking at the coverage, and all the coverage is about, how isn't it wonderful that Joe Biden was so selfless and the way he stepped down. And it was kind of like, as if he was a monarch stepping down willingly. He's an elected president. He has to. And it kind of shows you that, the other interpretation was like, here's an old guy who kind of misjudged the situation and then realized that he'd misjudged it and then got elbowed out by the backroom cabinet.
It's a really difficult one because, he is the elder gentleman in the room and he's been around for so long. He's been really good throughout his whole career. His presidency has been a bit mixed. He's made a few faux pas, but by and large, as a politician, he's a great guy.
He's been really, but the interesting thing is right now, the old mumbling, stuttering, slightly incoherent old fella is no longer Joe Biden.
Absolutely.
It's Donald Trump. So I tell you what we do, John, today, right? Let's focus on Trump and Vance. We'll leave Kamala Harris until next week, right? And we'll come back and we'll talk about the Democrats, their policies, their economics, all that sort of stuff. But let's now focus on Trump and his VP pick, J.D. Vance.
Can I just say, Mac, just from the outset, there's only one J.D.
That's true. And it's J.D. Davis. End of story. You're going to write the hillbilly elegy about your time growing up in Windsor Park.
Yeah, exactly.
The hillbilly elegy of Windsor Park, Monkstown, circa from the mid-70s to the mid-80s.
They were the hard years. Hard
years, yeah. There was recessions, there was immigration, there were the troubles, there was treeing in, there were games of curbs, all sorts of things. Also, there was games of rounders. It was a really difficult program. Anyway, actually, the Hillbilly Elegy, interestingly, published in 2016, and it was read in this house. And I'm saying that in the sort of passive case, right?
Yeah.
Shan read it and thought it was terribly badly written.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, she's a bit of a stickler for these things. But what was fascinating with the Hillbilly Elegy is it gave liberal America, and this is the interesting thing, it gave liberal America a hillbilly MAGA champion that they thought they could relate to. Because in a way, what J.D. Vance said, here's my life. This is why white people in the main are pissed off. This is who we are. We are the hillbillies. And this is an elegy for our life. Now, if you read the book, the extraordinary thing is the violence of his upbringing. That's the really interesting thing.
Yeah.
Casual violence inflicted on kids, on wives, on husbands, but particularly wives and kids from husbands. The extraordinary intrusion into people's lives of booze and drugs fueled with poverty. And then you get someone like Vance who managed to climb out of that. And again, he was from Ohio, which is not a state you associate really with hillbillies, right?
Well, that's the really interesting thing. He is the poster boy of the American dream, from poor boy to
the Yale law graduate.
Yale law, and exactly. And now to VP. But it's Ron Howard turned that into a movie, like Ron Howard. And it stars Glenn Close and Amy Adams. And I haven't seen the movie yet. I was looking at the trailers. I actually keen to watch it, but it seems a little bit kind of cliched, as Ron Howard's films often are.
Yeah.
But it is an important story at the same time.
It's a very, very important story, and it's not unlike the story that the Demon Copperhead story I was telling you about, the one I was reading there a couple of months ago. But the interesting, let's look about Vance, right? Because we know about Trump. But let's think about what the pick of Vance as his vice president is doing for the movement, for MAGA, right? And it's a fascinating. We're going to talk about this, and then we're going to talk about Ireland, because we left the last podcast talking about multinationals, John.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And the assumption being the multinationals will remain very much part of our political, economic, and technological firmament. The question mark now, as I think you were just putting to me just off air, is what happens now with the likes of Vance?
Yeah.
Right?
This isolationism.
Well, the MAGA movement is fascinating because in many ways, Trump created a movement called MAGA to give him and his personality a policy.
Yeah.
And he identified, okay, right, these people, remember he said, I love the uneducated.
Yes.
These are my people, right? And in a way, what he did was he appealed to people he knew were out there. And then he created a movement around that, like a branding and marketing exercise.
But
right?
that is his genius, actually.
Yeah, no, that is his genius. But Vance is different. So Vance is, as you said, from these people.
Yeah.
And he is actually going to politicize MAGA and make it into actually a movement that isn't just a personality cult, but could be something greater, right? So a lot of the commentary in the last 2 or 3 days, John, or 4 or 5 days has been, the Republican Party is a personality cult, it's Trump, all that sort of stuff. We all know that. Never has he been more dominant.
Yeah.
But in the choice of Vance, what he's basically saying is, you are my heir. You are my heir. And you are the heir, not to the Trump, it's not the Trump family or the Trump fortune or the Trump lack of fortune or the Trump this, that, the dynasty. It's you're an heir to a movement that can actually articulate something coherently to these people to give them something to go with.
Yeah, but I also think it's kind of interesting that there's 2 things about Vance that I find a little bit odd. One is he hated Trump back in 2016. Yeah. He called him a modern-day Hitler, a liar, all that kind of stuff. And then he's done a complete 180 turn.
Yeah.
So you begin to wonder about his conviction for a start.
True.
The second thing is, what he bangs on about a lot is about the elite and, Wall Street and stuff.
Yeah.
But he ended up there.
I know.
He crawled out of, in fairness to him, he crawled out of poverty, but ended up with the elite and being part of the elite. So
you're absolutely right.
It's a whole contradiction.
So we're going to take, this podcast is going to go in 3 directions to explain what might happen in Ireland and in Europe with a MAGA victory.
Yes.
Just let's assume that there could be a Trump stroke MAGA victory.
Yeah.
The first one is the timing, right? We're going to talk about the Berlin Wall, talking about the death of Davos.
Yeah.
And Vance is what I would say is a cross between Elon Musk and Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Right? Keep that in your head. Keep that in your head. He's a cross between Musk and Sanders. So this is a very new development. And the reason we start the Berlin Wall is the following, John. If Trump wins, he will also win on the same weekend as the 40th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Right.
The 8th and 9th of November. And the reason this is important is Trump Mark II, or Trump 2.0, as the Americans would like to say, constitutes a complete break from the politics of the last 40 years. So the politics of the last 40 years in America, particularly foreign policy, commercial policy, etc., was a sort of a synthesis of Reagan Republicans who, in their own narrative, won the Cold War.
Yeah.
And their peak of their power was the moment the Berlin Wall fell, because that suggested to them that they were right all along about communism. But it was a fusion of Reagan Republicanism with what I call Clinton Democratism. So the Democrats moved to the center, the Republicans stayed where they were, which was kind of right of center, and American politics recalibrated over the last 40 years. Now, what that meant was open markets, free trade, a lot of immigration, not completely open, but a lot of immigration, free capital movements. This is all around the world. The international dominance of international law, of trading agreements, of large institutions, the infiltration of global capital almost everywhere,
Yeah.
the era of big corporations, and what I would call the sort of the emergence of Davos man.
Yeah.
Of this is back to your idea of the elites, of people who were actually cosmopolitan more than nationalist. They were internationalists more than local. And they looked down their nose at people who were nationalists as some way atavistic, backwards. And their idea was get with the program. And the program is America and China are going to be intertwined, intermeshed, interlinked, and friends. Russia is going to be normal. The European Union is going to be old but safe. It's going to be like kind of a nice museum. And the United States is going to lead the world. And NATO is going to be the dominant global policeman, right? So that was the period starting with the Berlin Wall. Ironically, if Trump wins, it'll be a lovely 4-decade symmetrical end to those years, right?
Yeah.
So we can call this now the death of Davos. And by that, I mean all these assumptions about capital and Wall Street and shareholder value and basically the primacy of free market economics goes out the window. And what emerges is Vanceism, not Trumpism, Vanceism. Because Trumpism is basically, I'm kind of a criminal, I don't want to get caught, and I'm very good at branding and marketing, but it's all about me.
Yeah.
So let's assume, and I think you're right to say that Vance seems to be a man with very, very little center ideology, right? He moves wherever he thinks the populist march is. He's also a man who did very, very badly in elections. So he's not a very, very good campaigner for himself.
Okay.
And the fascinating thing, in June, 50% of Americans polled had never heard of him. 50%.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So he's only known in sort of intellectual circles.
He's not very advanced.
No. So,
Boom.
like, so see what you did there. So let's think, right? He is, and this is the Bernie Sanders, Elon Musk fusion idea.
Yeah.
So what Vance is into, he's against Wall Street. He is against large corporations. He believes that large corporations are un-American. And why he thinks that is that he believes that large corporations are the ones that have led to the extension of the American supply chain out of the Rust Belt where he's from and into the places like China and Vietnam and, surprise, surprise, Ireland.
Yeah, yeah.
And what he says is that is un-American because what you're doing is you are screwing local American workers, you are enriching shareholders, you are pushing all the income up the chain, not down the chain, and you are creating inequality.
Yeah.
In which case, he speaks the language of Bernie Sanders.
Yes, he does, yeah.
Bernie, right?
But he was a fan of Bernie as well. And he actually said that. He said, I agree with an awful lot of what Bernie says.
Well, this is your idea of the right and the left synthesizing together.
Yes, yeah.
He is very anti-immigration. Despite the fact that he's married to an Indian wife, which I find quite interesting, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm anti-immigration, but not in my family, in everybody else's family. Right?
Yeah. Indians are all right, but it's everyone else.
Indians are all right, yeah, but we don't. But the Chinese folk and the Mexicans, we don't like them, right? So this is, he's kind of cherry picking on all these sort of things. Like it's not as if he went and married the homecoming queen, Southern Belle, you know?
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
he married the daughter of Indian immigrants. So let's park that for a second. So he's anti-big business. He's anti-Wall Street. He's anti-immigration. Then he's pro-wage increases and increasing the minimum wage dramatically. And the way he sees all these slightly contradictory positions being synthesized is in a MAGA isolationist idea.
Yeah.
That's the economics, right? And then on politics, on foreign politics, he's pro-Israel, but anti-Ukraine.
Yeah.
And he's at least ambivalent on Taiwan. He's kind of taking the Trump line, well, to the Taiwanese, well, you got to pay for your own defense. And they're saying, well, frankly, if that's the way it is, we're gone.
Yeah.
Because China is China, right? But he's pro-Israel and anti-Ukraine. And this means that he is going to drive a wedge between the NATO and its allies, i.e. America and their NATO allies. Because America's NATO allies in Europe are more or less pro-Ukraine and anti-Israel.
Yeah.
And as Gaza gets worse and worse and worse, those positions will become hardened and hardened and hardened, right?
Yeah.
So what you have, John, is somebody who closes the book on the last 4 decades of what we would call normal global politics.
Yeah. But his views on Europe as well, the wider Europe, are very ambivalent as well. Like, for instance, he's always dissing Macron and France. And the other day he said about the first Islamic state that have nukes.
Yeah, he said it was Britain.
Yeah, it was going to be under Starmer, under Labour, which is really bizarre. I know there was a bit of kind of incendiary throwing in a grenade there to get things going. But, you know, he is, and the MAGA movement are flagging all of their policies way in advance, and they're really extreme. People aren't quite taking it seriously. We'll talk about Project 2025 in a minute, which is scary in itself.
What's Project 2025?
Okay, just a quick one on this. So when Trump won the election in 2016, there was a little bit of surprise, even amongst the MAGA heads. So
they were completely surprised.
Yeah, and so they arrived into the White House without a plan.
Right.
So that made those 4 years really chaotic, and they were all over the place.
Yeah.
They learned from that. So in the last 4 years, all of the conservative think tanks and all of the various different elements of the MAGA movement have been working away on a grand plan, a playbook, a MAGA playbook.
And this is it.
And this is it. It's called Project 2025. They'll arrive in, if they win the election, from day one with a playbook of how they're going to do it. And they set it out, you know, bit by bit. For instance, it has more trade wars, slapping 10% tariffs on everybody, on imports, you know, 60% on China and all. But then there's also a few quirky little bits in there. And this is the kind of scary bit. Have you heard of a thing called Schedule F?
Oh, Jesus, you're down the rabbit hole, my friend.
Well, I'll explain this one really quickly. Schedule F is a policy in the American administration where basically the American civil service is full of experts and all, and they're employed by the state, the federal.
Yeah, like here, like everywhere.
Yeah, they're federal employees. Schedule F will change their status so that they become employees of the administration. So that means that they can fire thousands of civil servants. And particularly where this will really play into it is that for the people, the experts in there, whether they're environmental experts or medical experts or economists or whatever, if they don't pledge allegiance, for want of a better word, to Trump and the administration, they're gone.
Well, these sort of ideas, this is where people are right to be worried about the fascist element.
Yeah.
Because one of the central, and it kind of annoys me sometimes, but one of the central pillars of democracy is the idea that the civil service is impartial and carries out state policy irrespective of who is in power or irrespective of their own political views. And that is a fundamental foundation of liberal democracies. So if they're going to go after that, then you have a very, very, very dark chapter, because that's what all fascists do. They create a civil service, they create a situation of no opposition.
Absolutely. But this is all laid out in a MAGA playbook.
So this is where Trump begins to really attack American democracy, because you can argue that economic policy, for example, the perception of tariffs or perception of immigration or perception of capital or where capital can go and cannot go, is within the broad realms of what we know to be policy choices.
Yeah.
Now, we are just used to, as I said, the 4 decades of policy choices that were very favorable to capital moving in and out. But when you begin to chip at the very, very central ideas of the autonomy of the civil service, the independence of the civil service, the fact that your experts don't just have an opinion, they actually are based on fact. And those facts have to be in some way regarded as superior to rhetoric. Then you're in a very, very dangerous position. Whether he goes through with that or not is another thing, because most people believe that the checks and balances within the United States system are sufficiently robust to make sure that those sort of elements of that Project 2025 can't be executed. But again, the dilemma is whether it's abortion or whether it is immigration, the Supreme Court is now very much stacked in their favor.
Yeah.
So when things go up, when legislation is, let's say, offered up to the Supreme Court, we know that the interpretation of the Constitution will come down on the MAGA side. So this is obviously, if you're an American, this is really terrifying.
Yeah.
And then you look and you think, okay, well, what about economics and finance? So one thing we do know about economics is that tariffs and trade wars increase inflation because they increase prices. Because the entire reason that you have trade is you go and you get the best price wherever you can find it in the world.
Yeah.
You re-import that price. So it's a low inflation world. MAGA is a higher inflation world. Now, where that will be seen is in the American long bond, in the American 30 and 10-year bond, because these are highly sensitive to future inflation.
Okay.
So what we're going to see in the financial markets when or if he gets in is on the run up, we're going to see an increase in American interest rates, long-term interest rates, because the core of the Vance-Trump or the Trump-Vance idea is higher inflation. Now, what Vance wants to see is higher wage inflation, which pushes up the workers of wages, and he wants this done through the minimum wage. But if you ally that with tariffs, particularly tariffs designed in a trade war very, very aggressively, what you're going to do is the cost, the price of reshoring American goods to America from Asia in particular is the price of everything goes up.
Right.
So you're going to get inflation. But the second thing, which is I find fascinating, is linked to your Project 2025 idea, is the notion that the central bank is independent. So one of the central tenets of American finance and democracy and Wall Street and the entire thing has been that the Fed, although notionally under the control of the administration in the sense that the administration has an idea of where the Fed would like to go, is independent.
Yeah.
So that Trump cannot ring up Jay Powell and say, cut interest rates, right? Now, if you're talking about this idea that the freedom of civil servants is going to be undermined, it will mean that the next Fed governor or the composition of the Fed board will be MAGA-ish.
Yes.
Now, what that means is that the Fed's independence, which is the basic anchor of American fiscal and monetary policy, particularly monetary policy, upon which the dollar rests, right, is going to be jettisoned. And if you have higher inflation coming through tariffs at a time when the vice president wants to increase the minimum wage and they interfere with the Fed and bring the Fed into their remit, you have a recipe for the dollar tanking.
Okay.
Because people will think, hold on a second, these guys are just going to print and print and print and print. So what keeps the mystique of America is the idea that the Fed protects the dollar and the dollar is strong and has been strong for the last 100 years.
So could it be the end of the dollar? Is that what you're saying?
It's not the end. It's just that these are, when you think about what's going to happen, right? You mess with a system that works at your peril.
Yeah.
What they're saying is it isn't working. It's only working for the elite. It's only working for foreigners. It's working for big corporations, etc., which is the Bernie Sanders idea, right?
Yeah.
But the other side of Vance Trump is the idea that big business and billionaires support them in huge, huge numbers, right? So either they're lying to the corporate sector or the corporate sector are being very, very naive. Because as you've seen the last couple of days, all these tech bros are all coming out, or not all, many are coming out in support of them, right?
Yeah.
And they're doing this because they believe that Vance once worked in a venture capital fund, right? Which is kind of bizarre, right? So the latitude for economic chaos in the next 12 months is quite broad and quite significant because you mess with the Fed, you change the anchor of the dollar, you change the anchor of the US long bond. US long bond is the most important interest rate in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
The interest rate off which the rest of the world's interest rates are based. That goes up. Interest rates everywhere go up.
Yeah.
And the perception that you're going to have a trade war with whoever you want and the perception that large companies are the problem because large companies are the source of the supply chains which have destroyed American labor, which is the Vance idea.
Yeah.
Now, you put all this together, John, and you come back to our idea of what happens to the little Irish multinationals.
Well, let's talk about that after this. Mac, in our last podcast, we were talking about what Ireland is going to do and its reliance on the multinationals, who primarily are American.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the potential of the J.D. Vance and Trump administration to possibly put the kibosh on the American multinationals and bring them back. What is that going to do to the Irish economy?
Okay, so my answer to this, John, is it's a great, great quote by a long-forgotten American president called Calvin Coolidge, who was the American president during the Roaring Twenties.
Yeah.
And he had a great expression. He said, the business of America is business. And what he meant was, don't fight corporate interests in the United States, right? It sounds great, but deep in the DNA of the Americans is this attachment to corporate capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think if these guys push it too far, right, the MAGA agenda, they will come up against an unholy alliance of liberal America and big business America with all the money and all the capital, and they will get severe pushback, right? This is my sense, right?
Right.
That if an American president actively decides that his enemy is American business, that president will lose. Now, you can say, well, in actual fact, you just did a fascinating podcast about Nazi billionaires, which basically says business will go wherever it actually will hold its nose and get into bed with whoever it can.
Yeah.
And will, right? So that's the counter argument, right? That basically what we saw is that big German business happily got into bed and endorsed fascism.
But you were also saying earlier, just a little earlier, that, you know, the tech bros are all signing up to this MAGA kind of movement.
Well, I think one of the reasons the tech bros are doing this is that their tabernacle, San Francisco, has become a nightmare for them.
Yeah.
And they blame the liberal governments of California for drug addiction and homelessness and all that sort of stuff. I think that some of the tech bros are going up, but my sense is that it's only when the reality of MAGAism is revealed. Because now it's all rhetoric and it's razzmatazz and it's conventions and it's, you know, speeches by Hulk Hogan and people like that, right? You know what I mean?
Yes.
This is
This
is not the future of the United States, as far as I can see. So my sense is that if they go against big business and the interests of big business, there will be severe pushback in the United States. But let's imagine that they win the 6th of November. There's a coronation period. There is a MAGA victory. They take out your Project 2025 from the top drawer.
Yeah.
They put it on the table and they start implementing, right? And one of the implementations is American capital will be forced to come home. Now, how they do that will they tax American multinationals that are abroad? I think it's much more likely they will do the following, that they will negotiate a position. They will identify enemies of the United States, countries that are clear enemies of the United States, of which the major one is China.
Yeah.
And they will, in effect, say, okay, anybody doing business in China, you are going to be blacklisted. The interesting thing about Trump and Vance is they obviously don't regard Russia as a threat.
Yeah.
Because they've decided that they can pivot away from Europe because they regard Russia as a Mickey Mouse country that they don't have to worry about, right? Which is a disaster for us.
Well,
right?
yeah, it just means that Europe has to deal with Russia and not them.
And if Europe deals, there is a scenario, you imagine, they start to tax American multinationals. The American multinationals come back and start negotiating with them. Mm-hmm. And there is a scenario that I think will be quite likely, which is that they will say, okay, if you're in the American camp and in the American zone of interest, you can continue there. But if you're not, you've got to cut your supply chains, in which case Ireland manages to avoid and evade this eventuality. But, and this is the interesting thing, if Europe will have to defend itself against Russia on its own. If that is the upshot, then it'll require a massive increase, a dramatic increase in Europe's military budget.
Yeah.
It will also, I think, switch the European Union from being a trade and aspirational political union into something much firmer, which will also require all members of the EU to be members of NATO.
Yeah.
Because there'll be collective defense. And this has the potential to drive a coach and horses through Ireland's rather ambivalent neutrality policy.
Yes.
Okay. And these are all things that could happen very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Could happen extremely quickly. That basically Europe will have to increase the military budget, but also Europeans will say, okay, we're all in this together because Russia is the common enemy. And if we're all in this together, you can't sit around free riding with your nice little tax system and your multinationals and your this, that, and the other and not be part of the military club.
Yeah.
So your military will have to come up. So you might be in this weird situation when Ireland has to increase a military budget that we've never done in our lives very, very quickly. So I think everything is kind of up for grabs, which is why I started with this idea of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
Because had you said the day after the Berlin Wall collapsed that the country in Europe that will do best economically, socially, culturally from the end of communism is going to be Ireland, everyone would have laughed at you.
Yeah.
Right? Because everyone thought at the time the countries that were going to do best were going to be Czechoslovakia, former East Germany, and we had Katja Hoyer on the other day saying that hasn't changed at all.
Yeah.
It was going to be, basically the idea was it was going to be reverberating circles away from Berlin. It was going to start in East Germany, then it was going to be Czechoslovakia, then it was going to be Poland, then it was going to be Hungary. All these countries would do really well. Nobody said that a country on a little island off the west coast of Britain was going to do best, right? We did best because American capital said after the Berlin Wall came down, great, we're going to go to Europe. But they said, yeah, but where in Europe will we go? Fuck it, we'll go to Ireland, right?
Yeah.
And nobody predicted that, which is why it's so important to frame it in these 4-decade-long ideas. If that unravels for us, I don't think it will. But if it does, and it has to be part of your risk assessment, then all bets are off because we lose our capital base.
But how do we prepare? I mean, can we prepare for that?
We're not at all. Sure, we're not even prepared for the weather next weekend. I'll talk to you on Tuesday.